Hello, everyone. My name is Tayo Oyedeji, and I'm the CEO of Overwood. Overwood is a financial service firm that democratizes investments by making safe, high-yield investments accessible to regular people. The way we think about it is that, across Africa, very often, safe, high-yield investments are only accessible to people who have a lot of resources, so multimillionaires to be precise. So what Overwood has done is to democratize investments by making safe, high-yield investment accessible to people with $200, $150 equivalent, or whatever it is. In Nigeria, about 50,000 naira. And so everybody can have access to the same thing that's accessible to the richest and wealthiest Africans. The second part of this series is actually the stages of financial independence. And during this part of the series, I'll talk to you briefly about the things that we need to do to go from stage to stage on our journey towards financial independence. Once again, I'm Tayo Oyedeji, and well, let's get into it. Okay. So Zig Ziglar said something that I find really interesting. He talked about life and said, life is in stages. And so that everything that occurs teaches us to prepare for the next stage of life. And so the question is, what stage of life are you in? And what are you doing to prepare yourself to move to the very next stage of life? So this series will walk us through each of the stages of life that everybody goes through, and finally focus on how we can leave that stage for the next one, which leads us on the way towards financial freedom. The very first stage is financially dependent. This is where we all start from. So at this stage, you only have expenses, you don't have income. Because you're a child, you're being taken care of by somebody else. Your parents or your guardians are responsible for everything that you do that you need in terms of income. The problem with this stage is twofold. First of all, many people stay here for way too long. So sometimes you see a 30-year-old that still lives at home, a 25-year-old that still depends to a large extent on his or her parents for everything. So that's a problem. The second problem with this stage is that even when you're relatively younger, to a large extent, your life and everything that happens to you depends on somebody else's decisions. So let me give an example from my own life, and I'll do this throughout so that you can sort of relate a bit more clearly with me and the things I'm trying to teach. When I was a kid, I was in boarding school. I actually went to boarding school when I turned 10, and I was in boarding school till I became 16, after which I went on to university. But when I was about 12 years old or so, my dad lost his job. And I remember clearly the uncertainties that followed that time. I remembered wondering if I would be able to go back to school the very next semester. I remembered going to school and not having enough, and that period of uncertainty actually got me to the place that I decided that my children were not going to go through the same things. And so one of the things I've done as a father is to create a fund that would ensure that if anything happens to me, if I lose my job, if I even lose my life, my kids will be able to get a good education regardless. And so the problem with being financially dependent is that your life and everything around you depends on the decisions of somebody else. The interesting thing about this was I've spent quite a bit of time working across Africa, multiple countries. And the story is pretty much the same. I had a really good friend in South Africa that told me about her father losing his job, and then the family had to struggle thereafter. I have another friend in Kenya that the same thing happened to. And so what you see is that it's not just a Tayo story, it's actually an African story. All too often, our fathers don't make the best financial decisions. And when you're financially dependent on them, then your life and everything around you becomes dependent on them making good decisions. So how do you move from stage 1 to stage 2? It's actually pretty simple. Get a job. Get a job. Get something that brings you some form of income. But even if you can't get a job yet, so you're a 12-year-old, you're a 13-year-old, you're 17 or whatever it is, so you can't get a job. You can study up on personal finance so that when eventually you get a job or you get an opportunity to earn an income, you don't do the same things that you've seen repeated across multiple family members in different parts of Africa. Now, good news, you got a job, the very first job. Now you have some income. The problem with the second stage, a lot of times, is that, as you can see, the income for many of us don't match the expenses, right? So your salary at this stage usually is not high enough to be able to meet all the things that you want. And so for many of us, we start taking on a little bit of debt just to compensate the difference between the income and the expense. This is a bad situation. And I remember this, being a part of my life. I remember when I graduated from my doctoral studies, and mine was different. My income was relatively high, but I had packed on so much in terms of expenses that the income could not even match those expenses. So we had to take on a bit of debt to match the expenses that we had packed on. And so the key solution at this stage is to just hold back a little bit and say, how much am I making, rather than how much do I need to spend? Those are two radically different questions. Many of us say, what do I want to have? Where do I want to live? What kind of car do I want to drive? That's a really bad question to ask. The question to ask instead is, how much do I make? And let that then guide what you can afford to buy, right? Do you see how that works? It's not what do I want, it's what do I make? And then what I spend then becomes a subset of what I make, rather than the other way around, right? So part of this is budgeting. To a large extent, to move from stage 2 to stage 3, the first thing you have to do is to create a budget that ensures that your expenses are lower than your income, whatever it costs. And how do you do that? Obviously, frugality and minimalism. These are not very common or very liked words in Africa. There are no words that are very, accessible, or words that we love to talk about in Africa, because we like to spend. We like to show that we're no longer who we used to be, especially if we're coming from relatively poor homes. And so how would people know that you're now doing well? It's by spending and because consumption. So now they can see that you have a new car, you have this, you have that. But to move from stage 2 to stage 3, we first of all have to reduce our expenses. We have to spend a lot less than we used to. And another way to do it is to seek additional income, because additional income can then help mitigate some of the expenses we already have and the debts we've already packed on. All right, so I'll move to stage 3 and talk a bit about this. This is where I know many people are, and this is the place of trouble. It's the place where your debts have risen so high that they are even higher than your income. You have so much debt that you wake up in the morning and you're trying to avoid creditors. You can't pick up your phone because maybe it's someone you owe money that's calling you. Your debts begin to worry you so much that it becomes a part of your life. Now that's a problem. That's a big problem. So again, it's the same model where your income can't match your expenses, or where your income is lower than your expenses, and so you need to take on more debt to make a living or to be comfortable. How do we move from here? Well, first of all, the debt has become a problem, so stop. S-T-O-P. Don't take on additional debt. Now, we talked about this during the second stage, but again, it's absolutely critical here to reduce expenses, do a budget that ensures that no matter what happens, your expenses go significantly below your income. Well, a lot of times people talk about, well, maybe you don't eat as much, and a cup of coffee may be too expensive and all that. Those are really, really small costs. Your 3 big costs usually are your housing, transportation, and debt servicing for many people. And so those are the 3 places to look at first of all. So in terms of housing, how much you pay for rent right now? And is there a way you can downsize until you pay off your debt, right? I remember when I was at this stage of life, I just moved to England to work on my MBA at Oxford. And we had quite a bit of debt from living way beyond our means, And it was me, my wife, and a kid. And when we moved to England, we moved from our 4-bedroom house in America to a 1-bedroom house in England, a single bedroom for all 3 of us. It was a huge adjustment, but I knew it was the only way we could live within our means. And so people think that, these things are just abstract. No, they're real. They're things that we've all gone through, So it's the first stage is obviously to downsize in terms of housing. And then the second one is to also downsize in terms of other expenses, to say, what am I spending on? Do a budget. Where's my money going? And can I direct my money a bit more purposefully? So I know that this month, this is what I'm spending, and I'm not spending beyond that, so that I can save more and get additional source to pay off all the debts that many of us already have done. Well, this is where the good news starts. If you've done everything I've talked about so far, then you move to stage 4. You're still financially precarious, but you're moving towards where you need to be. How does that work? So you've somehow managed to reduce your expenses in such a way that your expenses are now lower than your income. That's a good place to be. Your debts are still high, but for the first time, you started building an emergency fund. Now, this is critical. People ask me all the time, should I pay off my debt first or build an emergency fund first? So let me talk a bit about this. A good emergency fund is actually about 6 times your monthly living needs. So what do you need to live for 6 months is actually what a good emergency fund should be. But I think there's a middle ground for a 3-month emergency fund where you save enough to live for 3 months, and that's just a midway of some sorts. And in my view, I think you should do this before you focus on paying off your debt. Here is why. If in the process of paying off your debt, another emergency occurs, all of a sudden you have to go borrow again to fix that emergency. Unlike if you add an emergency fund, even though it's not very high, it's just 3 months of expenses. If life happens, you can always pay off the issues so if your car packs up, or if your grandmother falls sick and you're responsible for her medical bills, if something happens, you could take out of that emergency fund, deal with that emergency, and then continue with life, rather than just pushing everything towards debts first of all. So my view, it's a bit different from a lot of other personal finance people. But my view is that you first focus on building a bit of a buffer for yourself, so that if life happens, you can take care of it before you then go on and start taking care of your debt. So how do you move from stage 4 to 5? I already talked about it. Build your 3-month emergency fund and then immediately start paying off your debt. Well, the question then becomes, how should you think about debt? And here's a very simple model. Actually, I'm taking a bit of this from Dave Ramsey. He talks about the snowball model, which is start from the smallest debt. So you owe someone $20, for example, or the equivalent of $20. That's where you start from. Pay off that guy. Pay off the next bigger ones. Just go gradually, pay off the little ones until you have just a couple of big debt items on your list, and then you start focusing on the bigger ones. What that does is it gives you a sense of achievement, right? Rather than focusing on the $300,000 or the $3,000 big ticket debts that you have, you just paid someone off that's just $20. You feel good, like I'm walking out of debt. Then you pay the $50 one, and then on and on and on and on until you're out of debt completely. So now you've moved from stage 4 to 5, and you're ready to move on with your life. You're sort of financially balanced for the first time since we started talking about this. Your debts are fully paid off. You have a 6-month emergency fund, and it's fully funded. This is a good place to be. You sort of left the problems of stage 1 to 4, and now you're at stage 5. You're about to balance and become who you want to be. I remember when we got here, it was around 2011 as a family. I'd finished my MBA and we had moved back to Nigeria for me to work in the private sector, living in academia. And what happened was we immediately began to focus on paying off our debts and building an emergency fund so that if something happened as a family, we could deal with it without getting into trouble. And I think every family needs to do that. Remember, in recent times, this is 2020, in recent times, we've had to stay at home. We've had a global lockdown because of the coronavirus. Now, when this happened, many people struggled financially because they didn't have an emergency fund that was fully funded. What that meant was they had to struggle every day to eat, to pay their bills, just to survive. While others that had a 6-month fully funded emergency fund didn't have to take a lot of additional risk to move forward with life because they were ready for it. And so once you've moved from stage 5 to, how then do you move from stage 5 to stage 6? I think it's easy. Start investing. Now that your emergency fund is fully funded, you can then begin to invest actively. How do you do this? Well, we have a full training model that talks about investment, and I'll share details about it later as we proceed with this training model. Now, stage 6, it's a beautiful place to be, financial progress. Finally, your emergency fund is fully funded, you've started investing, and the beauty of investing is that now, all of a sudden, you have additional sources of income. You're making investment income that is different from your regular salary and your income, and if you're wise, you've still kept your expenses low. So your expenses are still significantly lower than your income, your emergency fund is funded, and now you begin to make investments. It's a good place to be. Now, I want to talk briefly about this because for a lot of people, when you think about investments, there are many ways to think about it. The first are active investments. So for instance, you start a restaurant, that's an active investment because you have to be part of it to manage it. Or you start a supermarket, or you start a small mechanic workshop or whatever, that's an active investment. You have to be part of the process. The other one is passive investment, where you're not the one doing the day-to-day, but you're just trusting your funds to fund managers or other people that know what they are doing with this. And so, for instance, that's so let's say you put your funds with Overwood. With Overwood, you get daily interest. And so the daily interest that you get becomes passive income because you're not working for it. You're not thinking about it. You're not psychologically involved in making that investment work. And so I think we need a bit of both, but I'm very big on passive income because I feel that's the way you'll be able to eventually leave what you're doing today and focus on what it is that you're excited about, which is the place of financial freedom. If you've done everything we've talked about very well, eventually, now, this takes time. This may take you 10 years, this may take you 15 years, but if you continue and you do this actively, eventually you get to the place where your investment income right here is able to cover all your expenses. That's the beauty of the model we've talked about. And at that stage, you don't need an income again. You don't need to work for anybody. This happened to me in, I believe in May 2016. I was heading a firm in South Africa. And one day I looked around and I was like, well, it looks like I can sort of live on my investment income. And my family was really far away. It was almost 24 hours total to move between South Africa and the United States to be with my family. And so it was time to move on from the job or from working for anybody. So somebody asked me recently that, so if you do that, then does that mean you just wake up in the morning and sleep and do nothing? No, it means you wake up in the morning and you ask one question: what do I want to do today? Right? What's important for me to do today? And so, for instance, that may mean taking on a class in data science. I recently finished a course on Python, for instance. That may mean studying. Now, right now, I'm focused on studying national debt in Africa and how it impacts the way we think about developments across the continents. Primarily because I just find it interesting. Right now, I'm leading a firm, Overwood, which helps people through this process become whatever it is they want to be. And so I feel like, if you can walk through the models we talked about, you can eventually become somebody that is able to do what they want to do. And remember, in the very first part of this, we talked about why financial freedom. For many of us, the work we do is not very fulfilling. It's because we need to make an income. And unless we make the income, our family is going to struggle. But if we walk through the model I talked about, we may eventually get to the place where we're able to do the things we really want to do, and our family still won't struggle. These are the kinds of knowledge that our fathers, they now have across Africa. This is the kind of knowledge that the guys that want to just spend and live big don't have. And this is almost impossible for them. But for good students of financial freedom, this is very, 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 very possible. Now, if you're able to move from stage 6 to 7, the next thing is then to build wealth, to build excessive wealth that's incredible. So your expenses are so low that they barely show up. But your investment income, again, you're not working for anybody, but your investment income is so high that it can meet your expenses and gives you room to give back to society. So you can build a hospital, for instance. You can, like Bill Gates, you can fund the development of a vaccine for the new pandemic. Like Bill Gates, for instance, you can be responsible for the eradication of polio across the entire world. Or you can just do whatever it is that's important to you in terms of making a difference across our continent and across the world. I'm not here yet. I'm hoping eventually I'll get here. But I've gone through the first 7 stages, and I can assure you that it's a journey that's worth taking. The one thing that I want to say is that I'm not saying that I'm terribly wealthy, because I'm not. Like I just showed you, I'm not. But my life is so simple that I really don't need a lot of money to be comfortable, right? And I think that's the key between pursuing financial freedom and living large. Because if you live large and you just spend everything you make and you'd have to keep making money to keep up that lifestyle. And so what I tell people is, do you want to invest into your lifestyle or invest into your life? Choose one, right? And that's the way I sort of see these things. And so I'm going to give you a homework, something to think about as we continue this entire process. The first one is, what stage are you on, right? Just go through this model again and seek to understand what makes each of the stages unique. And perhaps more importantly, what do you need to do to move to the next stage? We all have things that we need to do. So, I'm just hopeful that this has been of use to you. Thank you so much for listening to this. And I'll see you next time at part 3 of the model. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.